We are in Mark 13, lesson number 9 in your books. Lot to cover in chapter 13, but don't worry, don't stress. It's not the end of the world. Might be the end of the Jewish world, but it's not the end of the world. All right. Sorry. Yeah, I've been working on that all week, by the way. So there you go. Let's go to God in a word of prayer. Our great God, Father in heaven, holy is your name. You are sovereign, you are creator, you are sustainer, you are the ultimate authority in all of the universe. We love you, Father. We submit to you. We're grateful for a time today, like we always pray. Time to gather together as your people, time to gather together and study your word and remember your Son and praise you. Father, we're grateful for the time, and we don't want to go without acknowledging that. Father, thank you for your word today. Thank you for Jesus and how he is the great prophet and how he lets his people know what's going on in the future so that they can be comforted and informed. Father, we're so grateful for your word. Please bless our study. Please bless the studies downstairs. And in Jesus' name, amen. Okay, I think what I want to do, because we have just enough time to do this, is read this through. I think we can do this. So if I get a couple of volunteers, could I get someone to read 1 through 23? All right. And then could I get someone else to read 24 through the end? All right. We've got the elf keys covering it today, so all right. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. As he was going out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Teacher, behold, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." And Jesus said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left upon another, which will not be torn down." As he was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter and James and John and Andrew were questioning him privately. "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign when all these things are going to be fulfilled?" And Jesus began to say to them, "See to it that no one misleads you. Many will come in my name, saying, 'I am he,' and will mislead many. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be frightened. Those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. For nation will rise up against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will also be famines. These things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. But be on your guard, for they will deliver you to the courts, and you will be flogged in the synagogues, and you will stand before governors and kings for my sake, as a testimony to them. The gospel must first be preached to all the nations. When they arrest you and hand you over, do not worry beforehand about what you are to say, but say whatever is given you in that hour. For it is not you who speak, but it is the Holy Spirit. Brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child. And children will rise up against parents and have them put to death. You will be hated by all because of my name. But the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. But when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it should not be, let the reader understand, then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. The one who is on the housetop must not go down or go in to get anything out of his house. The one who is in the field must not turn back to get his coat. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. But pray that it might not happen in the winter. For those days will be a time of tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the creation, which God created until now, and never will. Unless the Lord has shortened those days, no life would have been saved, but for the sake of the elect, whom he chose, he shortened the days. And then if anyone says to you, 'Behold, here's the Christ,' or 'Behold, he is there,' do not believe him. For false Christs and false prophets will arise, and will show signs and wonders, in order to lead astray, if possible, the elect. But take heed, behold, I have told you everything in advance."
But in those days, after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers that are in the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. And then he will send forth the angels, and will gather together his elect from the four winds, from the farthest end of the earth to the farthest end of heaven. Now learn the parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and put forth its leaves, and you know that summer is near. Even so, you too, when you see these things happening, recognize that he is near, right at the door. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But of that day or hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. Take heed, keep on the alert, for you do not know when the appointed time will come. It is like a man away on a journey, who upon leaving his house and putting his slaves in charge, assigning to each one his task, also commanded the doorkeeper to stay on the alert. Therefore be on the alert, for you do not know when the master of the house is coming, whether in the evening, at midnight, or when the rooster crows, or in the morning, in case he should come suddenly and find you asleep. What I say to you, I say to all, be on the alert.
All right. Appreciate you, Elfgies. Thank you. All right, it took me a long time, and when I say a long time, I'm talking about decades of study and talking with people and reading and things like that. It's taken me a long time to come to the conclusion that this whole chapter is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem and really destruction of the Jewish nation. It's taken me a long time because there's other passages that talk about this, and other people believe some things like, you're talking about the end of the world here in those passages, and there's just been a lot of confusing things that I've heard and read over the years. But context is king. Right? You've got the words, you need to understand what the words mean, but you need to understand those words in context. What are some clues, really flashing signs, really, in this chapter, in this context, that point to the destruction of Jerusalem, and really only the destruction of Jerusalem and, the Jewish nation? Sir, what do you got?
One simple word is you. You mentioned context and who's been spoken to. I have Bibles where I've just underlined the word you all the way through, and you can do it all the way to the last verse of the chapter. And so you got to consider who he's talking to. He's talking to disciples living then and what's going to happen in their day and time. And he's not talking beyond that to a couple thousand years or more.
Good. So let's start there, because this is the way this chapter starts. Look at verse 1. He, that's Jesus, they're at the temple. They're going out of the temple, and as he was going out of the temple, one of his disciples. So already we have an historical time frame here, a time marker, a context. He's talking to his disciples, one of them, and they said, "Teacher, naturally, this is a really beautiful building, right? What wonderful stones here, what wonderful buildings." If you know anything about that temple, it wasn't as beautiful as the original, but it was still pretty amazing. And the stones were impressive and all of that. So they were in a context. First century disciples talking to Jesus, and Jesus said to him, "Do you see these great buildings?" So Alan points to some of the language of you. He's talking to specific people that were around 2,000 years ago. What else?
Yeah, as far as fleeing to the mountains, what would be the point if it was at the end of the world? They wouldn't escape, with that.
Yeah. Yeah, so we believe that there will be an end to the world, and the whole place will be destroyed with fire. But Stan brings up a really good point. If this was talking about the end of the world, what's the point of going to Mount Everest? I mean, you could go to the tallest, mountain that you want, and you still wouldn't escape the destruction. And so that's another good indicator. Yes.
Well, he tells the ones, to his point, the ones in Judea to do it. Not everybody. The
Judea. I mean, what would it really matter if you were pregnant or not at that point, right? Yeah. But it would matter if you were pregnant and in the wintertime in the first century, because that would be a difficult exodus from the region, wouldn't it? Another indicator that this is talking about first century stuff. What's some other... There's a really big red flag that Jesus is waving that I'm looking at in this verse, but I'm not going to, like, what do you got?
Well, in the one passage where he says this generation.
Yeah, that's the one I'm thinking about. That's verse 30. I almost thought about leading with this. Look at verse 30 again. Truly I say to you. So again, Jesus, we got to read this not from our modern day perspective, but this is an historical narrative, right? Jesus was talking to his people, saying, when you, as in personally, when you see these things happening, so when you are in this situation, in this moment, and you see with your eyes these things happening, recognize that he is at the door. I'm sorry, that's verse 29. Verse 30, truly I say to you, this generation. That right there just nails it. This generation will not pass away until all of these things take place. We have a firm time marker about when these things would start and take place. All right, sir.
Well, contextually, this comes at the close of his life, the last week of his life, and it follows in the other Gospels a clear denunciation of the religious leaders. And what is happening is that he is pronouncing judgment upon a nation in which he finds hypocrisy and hardened hearts and an unwillingness to accept God's Messiah. And so it is the announcement of a judgment upon a nation that has rejected God's Son, despite the miracles and the messages and the incomparable accomplishments that Jesus has produced.
Good. Last week we saw the parable of the vine grower. Prophet was sent, prophet was sent, prophet was sent. And then God said, well, they'll surely listen to my son, right, my beloved. But they didn't. And bad things happened because of that. This is exactly what's going on. As Jack's pointing out, this is judgment that's pronounced on a nation has been so stiff-necked and so hard-hearted and unwilling to see the truth in the form of Jesus right there in the flesh, right before their eyes, and submit to him. Okay. Any other contextual things that you guys see here in this chapter that indicate first century kind of stuff? Okay, with that in mind, with that solid base in mind, I think we can, honestly, I think the rest of the chapter just flows naturally. Okay, verse 1, he was going out of the temple. As he was going out, one of his disciples said to him, again, what an amazing building. I probably would have agreed with him. Jesus said to him, do you see these great buildings? He makes a prophecy. Not one stone will be left upon another which will not be torn down. That is not figurative language. That is a prophetic language that we know happened, because when the Romans came in and they took the city and they went to the temple, I understand they wanted to get to the gold that had basically burned and melted and gone down into the cracks in between the stones. And so what did they do? They took the great stones and removed them from one another. Not one was left on another. They completely wiped out the temple, as history tells me, to get to the gold. But the point is, Jesus called this ahead of time. But this wasn't just about the temple. The nation was going to be dismantled, one stone from another. All right. In verse 3, he was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple. So he was looking from the Mount of Olives towards the temple. Now Peter, James, John, Andrew were talking to him, asking him questions privately, and they wanted to know some things. You know, again, you got to see this from their perspective. They were still probably looking at this from a physical kind of kingdom kind of thing, and you know, that's not far off, because the physical kingdom that would be torn down would be the nation of Israel, but by the spiritual king of heaven. All right. Tell us, they believed Jesus, so tell us, Jesus, when will these things be? They wanted to know when, and you know, what should we look for? What will be the sign when all of these things, this destruction, is going to be fulfilled? I love what Jesus does here. Look at verse 5. He wants them to be informed ahead of time. He's a compassionate God. He cares about them. He wants his elect to continue throughout the generations. But he also wants his message and his messengers to go out into all the world. So he's going to give them information in the form of prophecy ahead of time, so that when they see the sign that he's going to tell them about, they and his people can flee and not be killed, and thus continue on the gospel mission. Sir?
It's important to see what follows the big picture is he's answering two questions, and he answers the second question first about the signs,
right.
And then he returns to the first question, which is when, which
right.
is this generation. I'm going to tell you, you got to be ready, and so forth. So that's important whether you're studying any of the gospel accounts on this and trying to come out in the right place. You've got to see what the questions are and see how they're answered.
Good. All right. So tell us when these things are going to be and what will be the sign. And he began to say to them, okay, don't be misled. Don't be deceived. You know, people are going to say the Christ has come. People are going to be claiming, I'm the Christ. And when they do that, they're going to be claiming, you know, I'm the Messiah. I'm the Savior of the nation. Don't be fooled, he says. See that to it that no one misleads you. Verse 6, many is going to come in my name, saying, I am he, and will mislead many. History tells us that happened. Look at verse 7. Here's some signs that Jesus begins to talk about. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, what's the action to be taken? Don't be frightened. He didn't say move out of the country at that point. He said, don't worry about that. Why? Those things must take place, but that's not the end. They wanted to know when the end would come. And Jesus is saying, that's not the end. And I love his explanation, verse 8. For nation will rise up against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be also famines. These things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. What's he saying there in that last verse? What's he trying to tell them, especially in that last verse? I mean, obviously he's trying to say, don't worry yet. Go ahead.
Ushering in a new age.
He's ushering a new age. So, I mean, I think it fits with the idea of the birthing process. Okay. But what's he saying with this idea of wars? You're going to hear about wars and rumors of wars and stuff like that. Sir?
Actually, he's saying these are not signs. People tend to view these as signs, but he's saying these are not signs. These are the kinds of things that happened prior. These are the kinds of things that are going to happen in the future. These are not really signs, but when these things develop, it brings out speculators and prognosticators. It's the conditions under which false prophets and false Christs arise and attempt to mislead and carry people away. But instead of these being actual signs, I think the reverse is the message. These are not signs.
Okay, so guys, we're married, we've had kids at some point. you remember when your wife was pregnant? Do you remember the Braxton Hicks contractions? You all know what I'm talking about? Okay. Did you get a little excited and a little bit, ooh, let's go, the first time those came in? Because, I mean, she was having contractions, right? Those aren't contractions. That's merely the body getting ready for something. But that's not the sign that you needed to go to the hospital. I think Jack's right. These are not the signs that they were to look for, because how many wars have you read about in the Old Testament? How many famines and earthquakes and horrible stuff, right? And to his point, how many wars are we seeing now? There's always been wars, there's always been famines, there's always been calamities. That I think Jesus is saying that's not a good indicator for you, Andrew, Peter, James, or John. Not a good indicator for you that you need to leave. That's not the sign you're looking for, because a lot of people will, and a lot of people will say, hey, here's these horrible things. I'm the Christ. Look at me, follow me. All right. So he's like, don't get worried about that. That's not what you're looking for. But verse 9, be on your guard. This is something that he's going to say throughout this whole chapter. Be on your guard. What does that mean, to be on your guard? What's another way of saying being on your guard? Be watchful. Be careful. Look out, because what I'm about to tell you will come, and you need to be ready for it. And you need to get other people ready for it. So be on your guard, and there will come a time, and I think verse 9 is talking about the history of Acts that we read about. The true life history that these men would have to go through and experience as God's ministers on earth. They will deliver you to the courts. You will be flogged in the synagogues. You will stand before the governors and kings for my sake as a testimony to them. Didn't that happen to the apostles? Didn't that happen to the ministers of Christ? We can read about that. And so as they were going through those kind of things later on, they would be able to remember the words of Jesus here, saying, hey, this is going to happen to you and to other people. The gospel must be first preached to all the nations. That happened in the first century. The gospel did go out. The disciples did do their job, and they went to all of the nations at the time. They went into the whole world and preached. But verse 11, there's going to be some help with this. It wouldn't be easy, but there would be some help. Verse 11, when they arrest you and hand you over, don't worry beforehand about what you're going to say, and say whatever is given you in that hour. Why?
God's going to give them what they need.
God's Spirit is going to be with them. So Jesus was going to go into heaven. Jesus was going to go away. He had been their teacher. He had been their counselor up until this point. But he would tell them later on, hey, don't worry, I'm going to give you a comforter. I'm going to send you help. And God's Spirit would give you the words to speak in those really difficult times. Very difficult times indeed. Look what would happen in relationships. And I think we're talking about Christians who would have to suffer with family relationships and things like that because of their faith. Brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child, and children will rise up against parents and have them put to death. And so this would be a great fire that would come upon God's people, testing them to see who they put their faith in. In fact, verse 13, you, the disciples, and the apostles especially, you're going to be hated by everyone. Doesn't sound fun, does it? You'll be hated by all because of my name. But, and I think this would have really, really mattered to the 12. Of course, it matters to us today, and it applies to us today. But this would have been very relevant to those men hearing what Jesus was having to say. the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. Oh man, I can just see Peter thinking about those words as he was going through those persecutions that we can read about in Acts. I will endure no matter what comes, no matter what they do to me, no matter how many times they beat me, or put me in prison, or try to cancel me, or put, anything like that. I will endure to the end. I will. Oh, there's a whole bunch of hands out right now. All right. I think I remember the order. Go ahead, sir, first.
I think he's really preparing his apostles and disciples to be forewarned is to be forearmed.
Yes.
In terms of the terrible things that are going to develop. But if we recall, it was just recently that they were asking about who's going to sit at the right and the left when he comes into his kingdom with power and glory. But what he's teaching them is that this is the nature of the Messiahship, and this is going to be the nature of the discipleship, that you will suffer such things. What a shock it must have been to them. But even in this last week, and especially in this last week, he's trying to prepare them for what's going to happen so that they can be forearmed, so that when it does happen, they will remember what they were taught.
Good. Very good. They were still being taught by the Master the nature of the Messiahship, so they can understand their role as disciples. They would suffer. That's okay, because of what would come in the end. Yes?
I think history has it that all but one of the apostles were martyred.
Right, all but John. Yeah. And John was, they tried to get John. He really did suffer quite a bit. Yes?
Just looking in context, it starts off where he's talking to these four specifically, but if you look back at Matthew 10, he's instructing all the disciples when he sends the 12 out especially, and that's when he tells them they're going to hand them over, don't worry about what you're going to say, in Matthew 10. And he's talking to all the disciples at that particular point. So I think there's a shift here in Mark where the four come up and ask him the question, but he talks to all of his disciples about this whole thing. So I can't imagine him limiting those four to knowing this and not the other 10 or 12.
Yeah. Well, for sure, what the four would do is go talk to the other people and the other Christians. All right, so verse 14, I love this. When you see, again, talking to specific people. So, forgive me, but for sure, right now, talking to the four, or the disciples. But when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it should not be, let the reader understand. Well, if we don't have any context, we're not going to understand what that means, right? Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Who wants to read Luke 21, 20 through 22? Can someone read that? It's referenced in the book. Who wants to read that? Luke chapter 21, verses 20 through 22. All right, Jack, you got it?
Then let them that which are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let them which are in the midst of it depart out, and let not them that are in the countries enter therein. For these be the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled.
All right, good. So these are the days of vengeance, which all things that are written may be fulfilled. Carrie, do you have another version? No? Does anyone have a version that talks about the abomination of desolation, or abomination, when you see the abominations of war? Yes, what do you got?
Let's see, mine says 20 through 20, right? Sorry. Those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Those who are in the midst of the city must leave. And those who are in the country must not enter the city. Because these are the days of vengeance, so that all things which are written will be fulfilled. And let's see, what does it say?
Oh.
I have a,
Matthew 24.
Yeah, oh,
I'm looking at Luke 21 at the end of that verse in verse 20. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is near. All right, so this actually happened. When Rome came in, as I understand history, they didn't come in and wipe the whole country out at once. It didn't happen just like in a day. They came from the north. They came from what we would know as Syria. And so they started in the north. They started taking over towns, and their armies were terrifying. And they just destroyed as they came. There would have been time, if you were in the region of Judea, to hear about that, and if you're close enough, you could have actually seen it. And so what Jesus says to these men, when you see these things, when you see, let me get back to it. When you see the abomination of desolation, when you see the war machine that would be Rome standing where it shouldn't be. Now, you have to ask what that is. One of the plainest explanation is, when you see the Roman army on your turf, then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. That's your sign to get out. And that's where we can understand what's going on. I mean, the one who was in the housetop, forget about going down, or go into the, or get anything from your house. I mean, don't take your coat. Don't do anything. And if you're pregnant, God help you, that kind of thing. And pray that it doesn't happen in winter, because travel in winter is just awful wherever you are in the world. But that's the point in time. That's the sign that they were to look for and to get out. Why was God interested in his people getting out at that point? Yes?
It goes back to what Jack said, that this whole event is a destruction, that's a punishment for the rejection of the Messiah. God's people would be allowed to escape. And history tells us that no Christian perished because of this warning.
Yeah.
They did get out, and they were spared. This was an event that had a particular design, and it was not designed just to wipe out a city generally, but to wipe out the unbelieving population.
Yep, I had forgotten about what history says about all the Christians escaped. Yeah, that's good. That's good stuff. God meant this as a discipline and a condemnation towards his unbelieving people, the Jewish elite, the unbelievers, the stiff-necked people. He never meant this to discipline Christians. And so he warned them ahead of time to get out, because they were the object of his wrath. He also warned them because he wanted them to continue the mission of Christianity and going to all the world. He's going to talk about that in a little bit. What do you got, sir?
Early in Acts, they left with the Jews persecution.
Yep,
So,
right.
So there's two persecutions when they are told to leave, and like you say, this one is to go spread the gospel, to get out of town. And so the Jews would persecute them, and then later the Romans would come in, and the Romans didn't care who was who.
Yeah, Romans didn't care. Yeah.
So there's more than once that the Christians are warned, and fleeing what's there.
Good. All right. Verse 19. There, for those days, talking about a specific time frame, talking about a specific era, if you will. For those days will be a time of tribulation or persecution, such as not occurred since the beginning of creation, which God created until now, and never will be. And this is just subjective, but if you were to look back at history, you'd be really hard-pressed, and I think it's impossible to find a time in which there was more trouble for God's people than this time frame. The whole world was against God's people. Because after the Jews were destroyed, the Romans tried to destroy God's people. But a specific time frame, and we'll just leave it at that. So verse 20, if you understand verse 19, then you understand verse 20. Unless the Lord had shortened those days or put a time frame, like bookends to those days, no one would have been saved. Like, especially like no Christians would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, for the sake of Christians whom he chose, he shortened those days. So again, God is not trying to punish the Christians. He's trying to punish the Jewish nation, but he's also trying to get the Christians out so that they would survive and continue to do his will and complete his mission to go out into all the world and preach the gospel. All right. More warnings, verse 21. Don't be fooled by the false Christs. If anyone says to you, behold, here is the Christ, or behold, he is there, don't believe him. I think the implication is if they had believed him, they would have stayed in the country and been destroyed along with everyone else. 4, verse 22, false Christs and false prophets will arise and they'll show signs and wonders. And I think they did. I think they did show some sort of signs and wonders. They exercised some sort of power. But they did it to lead people astray and, if possible, the elect. But again, here's the language. Here's the common theme. Take heed. Like, be on guard. Behold, I've given you information ahead of time, in advance, so that you're prepared, you're armed, and you're not going to be fooled. Keep looking for what I'm telling you. Yes, sir?
And he wants them to remember that he's the Christ. So you know who the Christ is.
That's a great point.
The Christ is going to be crucified, and the things are going to happen. So when others come along, you know that that's not who they are.
Very good. Very good. Okay. Verse 24 through like 27, kind of hard to understand. But again, if you take it into context, it's not bad. All right. In those days, after the tribulation, so after what was going to go on, around 70 AD, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers that are in the heavens will be shaken. One of the issues that I've had over the years trying to understand this whole chapter is that when I would read that verse, I would go back in history and look for solar eclipses. I look for signs in the heavens that were revealed in history. And I would just be chasing rabbit trails for hours and hours and hours, trying to nail that down. That's the wrong approach. I don't think that God or Jesus ever meant for them to look at the signs above or look for those kind of things, in 70 AD. You know what he meant? He meant that there would be judgment, God's judgment upon this nation. So this language, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light, it comes from places like Isaiah. Who wants to read Isaiah 13? Well, let's just go back to Isaiah 13. We don't have time to read it, but Isaiah 13, 1 through 6. I want you to see what I'm looking at here. I'm just going to refer to some verses here. So Isaiah 13, verse 1, here's the oracle, or here's the prophecy concerning the nation of Babylon, okay, which Isaiah the son of Amos saw. And so we know that it's concerning the superpower of Babylon. He talks about how God has commanded his consecrated ones, his mighty warriors. Verse 4, the Lord of hosts is mustering the army for battle. They're coming from a far country, from the farthest horizons. The Lord and his instruments of indignation read an army that he prepared to destroy the whole land of the nation of Babylon. Verse 6, wail for the day of the Lord. There's that language we're reading about in Mark. For the day of the Lord is near, and will come as destruction from the Almighty. Look at verse 8. They will be terrified. Pains and anguish will take hold of them. Check out the verse into verse 8. They will writhe like a woman in labor, right? It's the same kind of language that in the images that Jesus is talking about. Verse 9, behold, the day of the Lord is coming, cruel with fury and burning anger, to make the land a desolation. And he will exterminate it, sinners from it. For the stars of the heaven and their constellations will not flash forth their light. The sun will be dark when it rises, and the moon will not shed its light. Thus I will punish the world for its evil. Same language. It's the language back earlier that God used when he was pronouncing judgment on this nation of Babylon, and he would do it by rising up the army of the Medes. We know that the Medes and the Persians took the Babylonians and wiped them out, and they did that as a servant of God. In Mark 13, that's the language Jesus is talking about. He's not saying, look to the skies and look for signs in the heavens. He's just using this end of the world, end of the nation language to get them to see that like the Babylonian nation was coming to an end, like its world was coming to an end, the Jewish world would be coming to an end very quickly. All right. Verse 27, actually verse 26, they'll see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. Talking about Jesus, but not talking about a physical sighting of him. Talking about how they would see the effects of the Messiah's power and what he had done with the Romans over the nation of Israel. Verse 27, then he'll send forth the angels and will gather together his elect from the four winds, from the farthest end of the earth to the farthest end of heaven. Interesting language. I'll give you my best on it. The idea of an angel is to be a messenger or a servant of God. So it could be talking about how he's going to actually use angels to do this or oversee this process. I think no more practically, I think he's talking about messengers of God whom God would send out after the obstruction of the Jewish leaders had been removed, after that persecution of God's people had been removed. You remember how the Jews would go behind Paul and just create havoc in his wake and try to unteach what he had taught. Well, none of that would be happening anymore. The Jewish nation would be removed. And so now God would be able to send out his people, his disciples, his preachers throughout all of the world, and they would be able to go gather and convert people to Christianity in a way that was much easier. Verse 28, basically, he says, hey, look, you can read the signs when a fig tree is in bloom. You know that summer is near. Verse 29, even so you, again, them, when you see these things happening, recognize God's at the door. He's about to do this thing with the nation. Truly, I say to you, this generation won't pass away until all these things take place. So again, there's a time marker. And really the rest of the chapter is about them being on alert. Jesus continues, he kind of bookends his thought process, saying, be on guard, be ready for it. You've been forewarned, you've been given information. The master's coming, you don't know when he's coming. I think that's what verse 32 is saying, of that day or hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven or the Son, but the Father alone. But be on guard. He's coming. Be ready for him. Verse 37, what I say to you, I say to all, be on the alert. All right. Like I said, a lot there, but not the end of the world. Although it was the end of the Jewish world, and the people who had heard these words needed to be forewarned and forearmed. All right, thank you so much.